เปิดลำโพงนะโลอะโล
interesting. Speak something good. Welcome, everybody. Enjoy your evening.
Now we see how much delay we have on the phone.
Good evening สวัสดีค่ะ Dear members and guests, welcome to our October combined SPE Thailand and SPWLA Bangkok monthly technical meeting. For those who do not know me, my name is Sujintana, or everyone calls me Ning. I'm here to help run the meetings and support the section as industry liaison. Thank you for being here tonight, and we hope you will learn a few new things from this joint meeting. I'm hearing myself. And just to freshen up this meeting, we would like to ask if anyone here who are joining with us for the first time that would like to introduce yourself. Or perhaps someone would like to introduce your colleague who joined the first time. Yeah, okay. Okay, so guess we are all shy here. So I'm going to proceed now. Your last chance? No? Okay. So I think you are familiar with the mission and vision of SPE, especially the part where we provide you with food for thoughts and make you happy. But you might not know so much about SPWLA. Their ideas are not so much different from SPE, except their focus is on petrophysics. And they are basically here to provide information to our industry. And they want to play a major role in education and creating awareness. If you have time, please feel free to check out their website. So tonight, similar format. We will start with the section announcement, updating you the SPE Thailand status, followed by the presentation by our SPWLA guest speaker, which is the main program of this meeting. Once the speaker has answered a few questions, we will then move on with the closing remarks and then the lucky draw. Tonight, worth mentioning a continued trial of our YouTube live broadcast and Facebook live broadcast. This initiative is based on our webcast sessions earlier this year, not only assessing a larger audience, but also creating opportunity for people who is unable to join here at this meeting. Thailand section valid membership as of today is slightly over 800 members, combining 371 professional and 439 student members from Chulalongkorn University, Suratnari University, Prince of Songkhla University, and very soon Chiang Mai University student chapters. Not only to retain, but our section has also gained 38 new professional members since the beginning of this year to date. Please also note that we still have around 160 professional members from 2019 who has yet to renew their membership. So I would like to remind you to please recheck your membership status, and if lapsed, please consider to renew it. And to all of us, please invite a colleague to join our meetings, or even better, join SPE and or SPWLA, because we all need new members. SPE Thailand is still the largest professional oil industry organization where you can regularly meet and greet in a relaxed environment. On the topic of SPE membership, there are plenty of reasons why you should maintain a valid status and even more reasons to join. I will not go through all of them as you can see on the screen, but more worth mentioning is that the key benefits of belonging to one of the most active SPE section in Southeast Asia are the regular opportunities to network, share knowledge, and socialize with peers of the same interest in our industry. So let me pass the stage to Kun Andrew to share with us a few more insight about the SPWLA Bangkok chapter.
Thanks, Kun Ning. I am Andrew Cox. I am the president of the local Bangkok chapter for the Society of Petrophysics and Well Log Analysts, SPWLA. We also meet once a month, generally on the last Thursday of the month, down at the Jasmine City Hotel just next to Asok BTS station. So all visitors are welcome, so please do come down. Our meetings are fully sponsored, so with registration, it's basically free to anybody who can want to attend and come on down. And it's free because of our huge generosity of our sponsors, Scientific Drilling, Gaia, Emerson, Mubadala Petroleum, PTT, Chevron, and Medco Energy. We also have a sponsor from EMGS from down in Kuala Lumpur, so please do come down. As Ning mentioned, we're a non-profit corporation, basically based in Houston, that's the head office. Oops. Sorry about that. And we're basically dedicated to advancing petrophysics and the knowledge thereof. Anything to do with the physics of rock down the hole. We have a strong relationship with the Society of Core Analysis, and we are also interested in hydrocarbon, mineral and water resources. So basically anything downhole, underground. We were planning earlier this year a regional conference for the Asia Pacific region. Unfortunately, that had to be cancelled or postponed back in March. I think we all know why. We pushed it out to August and had to postpone it again, and currently we're aiming for 28th of February. That's probably not looking all that good either. We are playing it by ear at the moment. We're still sort of tossing up whether we can do it locally and have a broadcast version. So I don't know whether it's applicable to put your hands up if you'd come to a 3-day conference here in Bangkok in February. So we'd get 10 people. So it may not be enough. May not be enough. But we'll have to wait and see how it pans out. Some of the original publications or submissions have actually already been published on One Petro. So it's just the sign of the times, unfortunately. So our next meeting will be our first live meeting since Paul Johnson presented in January. Yep, we're going forward again. We're going to have 2 presentations. Basic topic will be wireline logging conveyance, how to get down the hole and back out again safely. We'll have Petromac Regis Vincent presenting for half an hour with questions, and we'll have Ronald Ford from Gaia Earth Group presenting with questions. So a special meeting with a special topic, and hopefully we can get quite a few people down to make sure they can get their tools out of the hole. With that, I'll wrap it up and pass the microphone back to Ning.
Thank you, Kun Andrew. Okay, and back to SPE most important slide. Please, a round of applause for our sponsoring companies. Compared to the last season, we lost some and got some old one bags, and we have 2 new names supporting us for the first time, PRS Asia and Uniwise Offshore. We are proud to have all the 33 companies on board so that we can continue to organize our technical programs at a nice venue like this for you here today, especially SPE member at a special rate. For those who have just joined us, please, there's still an opportunity to sponsor and see your company logo up here. Please feel free to contact any board member if you are interested. SPE Thailand section appreciate your support, and our society needs you. Without further ado, please let me hand over to the stage to our program chair, Kun Kasian, who will do the honor of introducing our speaker for tonight.
ขอบคุณครับ Thank you คุณหนิง My name is Kasian. I'm the program chair for SPE Thailand. And since Andrew already promoted his upcoming events, I'm also going to promote it as well. So next month, we will have meetings on a drilling subject whereby there's no presenters. Because we are going to be having a meeting here, actual meetings, where the presenter will be live from the UK. This is going to be the first time where we are having a good time, having a drinks, eat, and then watching the screens live. Let's see how it goes. And in December, if you join us regularly, you will know that December is always a break. But because this year we had COVID and we had cancel a meeting in March, so we make up for it in December. Since most of you will be stuck here anyway, you can't go back home, I guess. Or if you go home, you probably can't come back. So let's join us. We will have the 2 upcoming meetings to the end of the year. You will have the full program where Kun Ning will let you know what the speakers and the actual programs are. So without further ado, let me start introducing the speakers. So our speaker this month graduated in 2004 from Curtin University of Technology with a bachelor degrees in chemical engineering. He started his career in Australia with Woodside Energy and has since worked for various operating companies such as London Petroleum, Shell, and Total. He has worked in Australia, Libya, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Kazakhstan, and Thailand, and has 15-year experience as petrophysics and petroleum engineer. Our speaker was previously consulting petrophysicist for Medco Energy Thailand. where he was responsible for all petrophysical aspect of Bua Luang Phase 4 infield drilling campaign, including formation evaluation design, operational supports, and quick look evaluations. He also provided technical supports and assurance to regional non-operated and operated assets in Vietnam and Indonesia. He is an active member of SPWLA and currently serves the sponsorship directors for the SPWLA Bangkok chapters. He has previously served as technology coordination for FESM Kuala Lumpur from 2011 to 2013. He is currently studying MSc in Energy at Heriot-Watt University. Ladies and gentlemen, please a warm welcome to our speaker for tonight, Mr. Ryan Lafferty.
Good evening, everybody. This is my first SPE technical meeting also. So I do recognise a few faces, but for some of you, a warm welcome. Thank you for attending this evening. So first of all, thank you to Medco Energy for approving the data release for this presentation. And also a special mention to the Boalawang subsurface team, a few of whom are here tonight. So good to see some familiar faces from the office. Also a big thanks to SPE Thailand and SPWLA Bangkok. Without your support and stewardship, events like this wouldn't be possible. So thank you. I see a few petrophysicists among us tonight, but I'm aware that there probably aren't, there are other disciplines here. So I'm going to try not to bore you. I do hope that those non-petrophysicists, I can at least keep you awake for half an hour. I hope you're well inebriated, and I hope you take a couple of nuggets of wisdom home tonight to perhaps facilitate conversations in the office with your friendly petrophysicist. For the petrophysicists among us tonight, I hope that you see something new. If not, then that's great as well. Perhaps we could have a chat afterwards and you can correct me on everything I've perhaps done wrong or not. We'll see. So the presentation tonight is certainly nothing new or revolutionary. It's simply a summary of the workflow of a piece of work, an investigation that I did earlier in the year at the completion of the Phase 4B infill campaign for OFIA, now Medco. We had one of the wells which showed quite a erroneous resistivity response, and it wasn't really clear to the asset team at the time what the cause of that resistivity profile was. And I guess the important part of that was that it did affect our completion design for that well. So this will be a summary of the workflow. Perhaps might leave us with more questions and answers, but let's get into it. So straight into it. What do you see? Now that's a rhetorical question. But what we have here is a conventional, here's the point, conventional composite log of some basic log data. Gamma ray resistivity, so deep and shallow phase shift, nuclear tools, photoelectric factor, and then this final track is something that I often use. It's basically showing bulk density and resistivity, deep resistivity. And it's a nice quick look for those more junior amongst us. So often where you see anti-correlation can often mean hydrocarbon. Where you see them correlating or tramlining can often be water-bearing sandstones or perhaps shale. So I'm going to help you out in terms of what do you see. And what we have essentially is a potential hydrocarbon-bearing unit here, questionable water zone, and then a deeper hydrocarbon interval at the base of this well. What I've also shown is some interpretive data, so V shale, total porosity, total water saturation, permeability, and net and pay flags. So I think for most of us in the room, we'd say we have a an oil-bearing or a hydrocarbon-bearing unit. In this case, it is oil. Potentially water-bearing, we don't know. And then a deeper oil zone. Now this interval here is the interval of interest going forward in this discussion. Sorry. And perhaps what some of you might have also realised on the TVD subsea track is that this is a very thin sand. We're talking about 2 metres TVD subsea. So this indeed is a horizontal well. So this was actual data from one of the wells in this campaign, which forms part of the case study for tonight's discussion. So I guess the question to you would be, where would you complete? And that was the question that faced the asset team at the time. The original plan was to complete the entire upper sand interval. The lowermost sand interval was an appraisal target, so that wasn't a target for production. But we obviously see this very low resistivity saturation at the base of this unit. Of course, we don't only just have the conventional data. In this case, we were geosteering, at least reactively geosteering. And by that, I mean we weren't using deep azimuthal resistivity data. We were using a fairly shallow azimuthal resistivity tool. Now, the reason for that was that essentially in all the wells we drilled, we were keeping close to the top shale seal, the top seal shale, and just tracking that top boundary and keeping as crestal as possible at the well location. So there wasn't really any need for a deep azimuthal reading resistivity tool. What we see here is a real-time inversion canvas. So for those that perhaps haven't seen this before, we have the well bore annotated here. We see, and this is coloured based on a true resistivity from the inversion. We see that nice resistive package at the top of the unit. Obviously the deeper oil sand, which wasn't a primary objective. And then the remainder of the well bore, which for all intents and purposes looks like water. Now, of course, this is based on a model. It's a 1D inversion. So all we're really getting an idea of is the boundaries above and below the well bore. For those of you who are perhaps more accustomed at looking at inversion canvas or curtain data, you might perhaps observe that the data is quite noisy on the inversion, and also perhaps there could be a couple of discontinuities in that resistivity data. At the time, we didn't really know what this meant, but it certainly looks suspicious as to why we have this lower resistivity interval below the main resistivity interval and what was interpreted potentially as water-bearing sand. So a quick summary of the reservoir that we're talking about. This is the Boalawang field in the southwestern part of the Gulf of Thailand. We're talking Miocene age fluvial deltaics. We have a fair bit of grain size variation, fairly well sorted. I mentioned the sand thickness. In the deeper reservoir unit, in the lower sand, we see thicknesses of 10 to 15 metres TVT. A couple of things worthwhile noting. Kaolinite and illite are predominant clay types, and we have very fresh formation water salinity. So as a petrophysicist, this should be setting off alarm bells in your head. We did have some specialist log data. So we had NMR, triaxial resistivity, and OBMI image logs. We also had a bunch of core, about 150 metres or so. One thing to note here is that this sediment, these rocks are very moderately consolidated. So at surface, it's like beach sand. You can pick it up in your hand and it just falls apart. That has implications for your core analysis protocol, but also drilling as well. This is quite soft sediment. Obviously, the sand being so thin, there is no seismic expression. It was dominated by the lower sand. So the target well, or the case study, was located in the south of the field, and the model there was based on well data and a geological model. So yikes, right? No seismic control. This was where the sand was best developed. It was the first well in the field targeting this shallower sand. So, to get some surprises wasn't too unexpected. We also have a couple of wells, offset wells, that had the specialist log data, and we're talking 1,000 metres to 1,500 metres distance from the horizontal case study well. So, some possible explanations for low resistivity. I'm sure you've all seen this before. I won't address all of these. Particularly, I won't be addressing fluid effects in this scenario because that was fairly quickly ruled out. But what I will be looking at is thin beds, Fassey's variation, and the geometric effects. So, of course, the classic thin bed problem, laminated sands and conductive clays can give rise to low resistivity. Fassey's variation, so grain size, sorting. Now, often that's the case where you see high bound water or high irreducible water saturation, but that's not always the case, and I think this is an example of such a case. Clay type and clay distribution, so the morphology of your clays. Mineralogy, i.e. fool's gold, pyrite. And then geometric effects. So obviously this is a horizontal well. When you're drilling horizontal wells, the relative dip is important, and if you throw into that anisotropy, then that can often give rise to unusual resistivity responses. So we'll address each of those individually. I guess the thing to remember is that these aren't all individual factors. So you can get a number of these factors at play. They're not mutually exclusive, essentially, right? So you do need to try and at least break it down individually, but have in the back of your mind that you can have more than one factor affecting the response in your data. So we have a couple of images here, one from Grant Heavysiege out of Malaysia, so looking at Malay Basin data, and another from Paul Worthington, I believe looking at a more regional data set. And what I've annotated on these two images is where our reservoir lies. And essentially what we're looking at in both these cross plots is V shale, or a shale conductivity, and salinity, effectively on the x-axis, or formation water resistivity. Really what you need to take away from this is that when you get in these low resistivity low formation water salinity reservoirs, which is often referred to as low contrast pay, then your log-derived saturation starts becoming problematic. So if you have a reservoir where you see fresh formation water salinities, so less than 5,000 ppm, in fact, Grant actually comes to the conclusion that anything less than 15,000 ppm becomes a problem, then beware of your log-derived water saturation. That should be the first red flag. In these scenarios, you're no longer relying on the formation water or the connate water, the connate water to predominate the resistivity response or the conductivity of the rock. You're starting to rely on surface conductance. So you need to have a think about what's happening at the surface of the grain. And that's where we start talking about clay morphology and clay distribution. So thin beds. I think we can all agree that there's no conventional thin beds in this plot. What we have here is a section of core actually taken across the upper sand. We have both white light and UV. This is the 1 metre thick sand section under fluorescence. No thin beds, at least no conventional thin beds in terms of the clay sand laminae. The lowermost sand, we also have some core. These are both UV photographs. Again, not a huge amount of fluorescence, but certainly no thin beds, no classic thin beds. So it's fairly easy to rule that one out. It's perhaps also worth mentioning that we had triaxial resistivity data from one of the offset wells, and that indeed also showed minimal electrical anisotropy in these rocks. There was some, but likely attributed to grain size variation. Other approaches you could use if you don't have the core image logs is something like a Thomas-Steiber cross plot, for example, to see how that clay distribution plots out. Now here, density neutron cross plot. The petrophysicists among us should have all seen this before. You have your fairly conventional boomerang, some of us call it. But basically what I want to show here is we have the density neutron data from the offset wells, shaded for the upper sand and the lower sand. And we have some thin section petrography, grain size data, and mineralogy from XRD. We see some variation in the scatter of the data points. But if we move from the green to the yellow, so going from this interval here, the cleanest of the lower sand, up into the upper sand, we're going from this thin section to this thin section over here, and this XRD to the yellow XRD. Now, straight away you can see, you could fairly conclusively determine that there's very little change in the mineralogy. Perhaps there's some reduction in grain size we're seeing on the thin section. Unfortunately, as in most cases, we didn't have grain size data for the yellow sand, so it's hard to make a quantitative statement there. But really isn't a lot going on here, perhaps some finer grain size, maybe some sorting variation. As we then move to the maroon coloured points, and this is fairly consistent with conventional thinking, you start to move towards what some of us in the industry refer to as the silk point or poorly sorted apex. You start to see an increase in the clay content, a reduction in quartz, and although it's not entirely clear here on the LPSA data, you do see a reduction in grain size from about 350 microns to 250 microns, which for me isn't a significant amount, but could well be enough to affect the resistivity response in these rocks. So there's no smoking gun really in this plot here in terms of looking at the differences between the conventional log data between the lower and the upper sand. A couple of beautiful images here, SEMs for the geologists amongst us. In the Boiluang field, it's fairly immature. We don't see a lot of diagenetic overprint. What we do see, though, predominantly, is the alteration of potassium feldspar. And with that, we get some illite and kaolinite. What you're seeing up here is the grain, so the sand grain, and a nice big pore throat. And you're seeing what has been characterised as vermicular or booklet kaolinite. Now, to the petrophysicist amongst us, you say, well, kaolinite, not a big problem, has a fairly low CEC, so that's a cation exchange capacity. The illite, of course, a bit higher CEC, so can cause problems. But when you think about the fluid that's in that pore space being fresh, then the electrical conductivity of that rock is going to more preferentially flow at the grain surface as opposed to within the pore if it was a very conductive formation water. One thing also worth noting here is that kaolinite can be a significant problem for formation damage. So if you have kaolinite in your reservoirs, even with pore throats this size, once that kaolinite has been damaged or removed, they break up into small plates. And the analogy, of course, is you have a stack of A4 papers, you throw them up in the air, they land on the floor, and they scatter all around. That becomes a blocking mechanism at that pore throat. That's not the topic of tonight's discussion, but certainly something to be aware of if you do have product injectivity decline or productivity decline in your reservoirs. So looking at some data. As petrophysicists, we like to draw correlations in data sets. What we have here is some data points from electrical properties, namely cation exchange capacity, or what we refer to as QV. For the non-petrophysicists amongst us, this here is a saturation equation, a shaly sand saturation equation, and QV is a key input into the evaluation of saturation in these reservoirs. It's an attempt to account for the non-archy behaviour of the rock when we do have excess conductivity attributed to clays. And that excess conductivity from clays is due to the clay structure, and when that's saturated in brine, you do have excess cations that give rise to increased conductivity, which of course reduces your resistivity. So, what do we do with this data? Well, we can draw a number of different relationships, and what we're really trying to do is determine a continuous QV profile through the wellbore. Now you can clearly see here there's quite a range in that data set, quite a scatter. What I have shown is the dark grey being the best match to core, the dashed grey being an internally consistent log-derived QV from a water-bearing zone, the pink being an NMR-derived QV from clay-bound water based on this this paper, and then some analog data from the Brunei Delta. What we landed on for the Boalawang main reservoir target, where the majority of the STOIP is, was this low-case Miocene analog, which was consistent across the porosity range of our reservoirs with the log-derived internally consistent approach and the NMR. Now, of course, does that mean it's representative? I don't know. But this at least shows the range in the uncertainty of QV. Now, what that means in terms of saturation terms is you could have uncertainty or a range in saturation of up to 40 SU, which is indeed what we saw in these reservoirs. If we look at it in a composite, and the three last tracks are the ones we're most interested in, I've run 3 QV scenarios on one of the vertical wells. So the best technical estimate, which is based on that low-case analog, the best fit QV through the core data, and then a high-case QV based on analog. Now, in the lower sand, which contains the majority of our reserves, and what we're also looking at is the dashed black, so the shaded green is our log-derived saturation. Annotated in each track is the saturation height function-derived saturation, which is essentially shaded grey, and some Dean Stark plugs. So first of all, we see that obviously the Dean Stark water saturation is consistent with the capillary pressure model, but we have significant disconnect. Now remember, this was our best technical estimate in this reservoir in terms of log-derived QV. In our target upper sand, we see a significant undercall of oil saturation. Obviously, as we increase the QV, we get a much better match using the high-case QV model. It indeed matches the capillary pressure and the Dean Stark, both of which are independent measurements of water saturation. Now, some of you may ask, well, why didn't you just use the high-case QV throughout? So if we look down here, we actually have a water-bearing sand at the base of that package. The BTE QV was what gave us an internally consistent, what gave me an internally consistent log-derived water saturation. What you don't want to see in virgin water zones is a significant overcall of oil saturation in the water leg. You need to use that as a calibration point. So what does this suggest? It suggests perhaps that we have maybe a facies dependency, so there is some change in this upper unit. And then the question is, well, what does it mean and what do we do about it? And then how does this relate to the horizontal well resistivity data that we saw in that previous example? So moving into the horizontal well, a similar density neutron cross plot that we saw from the vertical wells. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me okay like this? Because this is quite uncomfortable. So for the horizontal well, I'm plotting the dark maroon and the green, basically across the point where the resistivity drops. What we're looking for here is a change, any clear change in lithology that might explain that resistivity reduction. This was what was used during real-time operations to help determine where we may complete this well. If we look at it on a density neutron cross plot, very little change. Now this is azimuthal density neutron data. And unfortunately, the well was drilled in the zone of exclusion, so we don't actually get any bin data for this density neutron data. It's essentially the average. We see very little lithology change in the well data. So how do we explain the resistivity drop? We thought maybe grain size or clay distribution that we saw on the previous density neutron cross plot could explain it. Clearly, that's not the case in the horizontal well. So now, looking at the horizontal well data, doing exactly the same as what I did previously for the vertical well. We're seeing across the interval, even with the high case QV, we have a saturation, an oil saturation undercall of 20 SU. So even with our high case QV, which we thought was well calibrated and was a reasonable range for the data, we still can't explain the capillary pressure derives water saturation in this well. Interestingly, we have a composite of grain size from the well site, which seems to suggest a reduction in grain size. So this is a grain size plot here showing a reduction in grain size. So the well site geologist identifies that there is some variation in the rock grain size in particular. And that seems to tie in nicely with that undercall of oil saturation. Now, perhaps if we'd understood this high case QV model and we believed it was representative for this upper sand prior to drilling the well, maybe we would have said, okay, well, it's all oil saturated. There's clearly no water bearing zone there. We should complete it. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. We were looking at a saturation plot like that. So there was still some concern as to what was causing this. Obviously, in hindsight, maybe your decision might have been a little bit different. But it suggests, this plot here suggests we still have a problem. We can't explain that away. So what can explain that? So a quick Induction Resistivity 101. We were running with the Schlumberger Periscope HD tool. So this is a diagram of that collar. Essentially, you have a number of transmitters and a number of receivers. So in this case, 6 transmitters and 4 receivers. With the Periscope tool, you also have these tilted coils. What that means is you get directional curves. So in theory, you should be able to get an idea of a resistivity response from the raw phase shift and attenuation data and identify where that's coming from. The other thing to recall is that in this collar, we get a conventional resistivity also. So your conventional arc resistivity for the likes of the Schlumberger folk amongst us. In our reservoir conditions, you're only having a radius of investigation of less than 1 metre. With the periscope data, it's a bit higher, about 3 metres radius of investigation from the wellbore. So we're using a slightly deeper reading tool that also gives us some directional data. Also, in terms of LWD induction resistivity, it's important to remember that the tool in this scenario is measuring a combination of both vertical and horizontal resistivity. So you do have to account for that when you're doing the resistivity modelling, in this case the inversion modelling that I'll discuss shortly. In a vertical well, the classic vertical well, I'm sure you've all seen it before, your induction tool will basically, your horizontal resistivity will be dominated by the shale. That is your classic thin bed problem, where the conductivity of the shale dominates the resistivity response. But of course, we're interested in a horizontal well or a well that's near horizontal. So I looked at this problem and went, okay, well, the conventional petrophysical approach doesn't quite explain the response. Let's have a crack at inversion. Now, this was the first time that I'd performed this workflow in TechLog. And the approach I'm going to discuss here is a layered earth model. So it's a 1D inversion, similar to what we do in real time. You can invert for bed anisotropy, boundary, and dip. It's pseudo-automatic, but it's still quite time-consuming. This is a manual process, so it's not actually something that you, as a petrophysicist, could do in real time to support real-time operations. Certainly, after the well has been drilled, you have time to look at the data, you can spend a bit of time on this. The process follows that you would generate a structural model. You would populate that model with assumed values of horizontal and vertical resistivity. You would forward model that response based on the tool physics. You would then compare that with the actual measured resistivity, and you would iterate until you get modelled logs that look like the logs you've measured, and hopefully a realistic geological realisation. So this was done on vertical well A. What we're looking at here is the blue being the horizontal resistivity, the red being the vertical resistivity, and they're assumed parameters. The green and red here are the forward modelled results compared with the black curve, which is the measured resistivity. And an output of the layered earth model is you get a true dip azimuth true dip and true dip azimuth. So what we're seeing here from the vertical well data, so we've inverted for bed boundary position, bed boundary dip, and anisotropy. We get a true dip of about 34 to 50 degrees. We get a true dip azimuth of around 200 to 225. We're seeing a fairly good match throughout. There is some breakdown in the lower unit, but we're not really concerned about that. So what we conclude from this, A, bed boundary effects really aren't having a considerable impact. And B, we do have some fairly decent or large true dip. Now, of course, if you look at the seismic, and I speak to my geophysicist, they would say, well, the structural dip from seismic is less than 5 degrees. So 34 to 50, where do we get that? That's likely the internal dip or the sedimentological dip, for want of a better word. But within these packages, we are seeing fairly high dip in the sand beds themselves. We also get the azimuth. So what do we do with that? Well, ideally what we want to do is get some representative values that we can use for the horizontal inversion. But before that, what I wanted to do was try and validate those true dips and true dip azimuths. One way to do that is if you have image logs. So in this case, we had OBMI. Another way is from triaxial resistivity data. We also had triaxial. The OBMI data was processed by a third party, and we're seeing true dips of 26 to 30 degrees and true dip azimuth in the order of 180 degrees. Fairly similar to what we saw from the layered earth model on vertical well A. The triaxial data, unfortunately, I didn't really trust it. First of all, we had no processing report available for that data set, and clearly there's something going on here in terms of the resolution of that data set, and really it's not reflecting anything we've seen from other well data sets, namely the OBMI and the layered earth model inversion. So from this gave me a bit of confidence in that the true dip azimuth and the true dip itself was near enough representative and could be used for the horizontal inversion. So, simple model, simple layering. This was based on the pre-drill structural model, or near enough close to it. Of course, we're interested in this upper sand unit now, so we're looking at the deep resistivity and the shallow resistivity in red, and the dashed light green and dashed dark green are our inverted responses. In the lowermost sand, a good match, but we're not really bothered about that. We're bothered about what's happening up here. Clearly, a very poor match. We can't, whatever we do, we really can't honour the measured resistivity response. And that's just showing the inversion canvas overlays that initial structural model reasonably well. So a poor match in the upper sand, and this was assuming less than 5 degrees true dip. We know that's actually not the case. So let's throw the simple model out, and let's bring in what we think is more representative. So here we're using the dip of 30 degrees that we validated from OBMI, so the oil-based mud imager, and the inversion from the vertical well. And we're seeing a much improved match over this interval. Now, what I've tried to annotate on here is sort of the thickness of that, the gross thickness of that sand. And then obviously we see some internal dipping that's required to give us that resistivity response. So we've honoured the well data from vertical offset wells. We've seen an improved match with the measured resistivity data, which is great. But it really doesn't, it still doesn't explain this low resistivity response in the deep resistivity after about 1,100 metres total horizontal length. So where are we now? What else could be going on? Certainly anisotropy and the dipping of the beds can't explain the resistivity we're seeing. So I apologise for this plot because this was a last minute addition. But what I'm showing here, and the track we're really interested in is this last track, these last two tracks. So this is the raw attenuation and phase shift data from the periscope. And with the periscope, you get what they call an anti-symmetrized and symmetrized measurement. The symmetrized is the directional measurement. And we see an interesting observation. So where we see all our conventional resistivity data dropping, about this blue line, we see a sign change in two of the curves, the pink curves. Now what I'm told by the Schlumberger folk is that this is attributed to a conductive feature away from the wellbore. So when you see this sign change, it's indicative, in this case, of a conductive feature below the wellbore. Now we do have to be a little bit careful with that because of the fact we are drilling through the zone of exclusion. So our azimuthal direction and binning of the curves is a little problematic. Unfortunately, at the time that this report was written, and I'm not sure if it has changed today, perhaps if there is someone from Schlumberger, they could enlighten us. But there's no way of doing any inversion on that curve data. So we really can't quantify what it means. All we can do is make some qualitative comments that we have a conductive feature below the wellbore. So what? Is it water? Is it a shale baffle or shale plug? We know in these fluvial reservoirs in Bualawang that we do get intermittent and quite variable presence of these shale baffles, and we know that has an influence on the production behaviour of these wells. But is that indeed what we're seeing here? So since this is a petroleum engineering forum, I couldn't finish without a production plot. So this is showing about 6 months of production. The solid green and solid blue are actual oil production, oil rates in barrels of oil per day, and the solid blue is water cut, compared with the dashed lines, which is the pre-drill modelled water cut and oil production for this well. So, two things to observe. Early water cut development is fairly characteristic of these wells in Bualawang, so we're not too bothered about that. Secondly, up here I'm showing where the well was actually completed versus where it was completed in the model pre-drill. So we actually reduced the completion length by about 50% because we were concerned we couldn't quite rule out the possibility of movable water. So we did reduce the completion length, and at the time that was supported by an initial reservoir model that suggested it's fairly insensitive to that completion length. But is it telling us something about the reservoir? Obviously we're producing at a much higher oil rate. Water cut is not too bad. Now I'm told from some of the friendly colleagues in the team that these reservoirs are seeing fairly well stabilised pressure. They're all produced with ESPs, and this is a standalone screen completion. But this horizon is seeing this sand unit is seeing fairly good, and really, in my layman opinion, seems to be quite insensitive to that completion length. So I guess there's potentially a question here as to, is there room for optimization of the completion? I don't know. But really, was it a problem after all? I mean, if the conductive feature was water and we had a water source nearby, then we'd probably expect to see higher early water inflow, which we don't. So the likelihood is it's probably some conductive shale feature that deep resistivity is observed. We don't know. I think it would be really handy to see what 3D inversion modelling can do to see if it can try and remove some of that uncertainty. But at the end of the day, it didn't hurt us, right? We made a tough decision to reduce the completion length, but the well has been behaving fairly well. I think, in fact, it's probably one of the good producers from the Phase 4B infill campaign. So, in closing, I think fresh formation waters, if you have that problem in your reservoir, throw out log-derived saturation, really leverage any core data you have, so particularly capillary pressure and electrical properties. If not, acquire core, probably a dirty word these days, but be aware of it. Grain size variation and clay conductivity is something you need to be cognizant of. Certainly for me, grain size variation is something I would have liked to have spent a bit more time on. And there is a direct implication for completion design and optimization. I don't know what the cost impact was of reducing that standalone screen length by over 50%, but I'm sure there was some cost savings there. Could it also apply to your other wells in the field which are cased and perforated, for example? Obviously, there would be a more significant cost saving there. I didn't really go into it in too much detail, but Dean-Stark extraction water saturation is critical in these reservoirs. Yeah, it is one of the only direct measurements of water saturation you'll get. It's cheap, it's inexpensive, it can be performed as part of your RCA program, it's non-destructive, and as is often the case, we only ever see this data generally in up-dip appraisal wells. So the number of reservoir reviews I've seen, we get these fantastic data sets, but they're always at the top of the structure. That, of course, is great for validating an irreducible water saturation, but what about the water saturation profile in the transition zone? Grain size modelling. I did do some work on NMR, and initial insights suggest that there is a good correlation between grain size and QV. So that perhaps if I had more time to work on that, perhaps you could derive a grain size profile. Would that be used for facies identification? Would that have an input into completion design optimization? Consider a MAD pass. So I think this is, probably in hindsight, we wouldn't have done it, but a MAD pass is a measurement after drilling pass. So you drill the section, LWD, you have a strange resistivity response, you're not quite sure what it means, you could pull out. Now the drillers are going to love you, of course. You would have to wait. You'd have to wait for that oil-based mud filtrate invasion to move into the formation. Now, of course, if you see an increase in resistivity, then the likelihood is that you're probably in a water zone where you've seen oil-based mud filtrate invasion into the formation, perhaps confirming that you have got water or not. But I think you need to keep your eye on the prize. We wouldn't have done that here. Poorly consolidated, semi-consolidated sands. It was a long horizontal hole section. It was a production well. You don't want to risk it. So get in, get out, complete it, and be done. But something to keep in mind, it's horses for courses. Inversion, it's a useful tool. It's worthwhile having a look at. I think it needs to be complemented with the conventional analysis, so really understand your uncertainty, understand your geology. Remember, it's non-unique, and it's very time-consuming. So I remember the quote that came in from a contractor to do the inversion work, and I didn't even present that to management. It was a lot of zeros, and really didn't think the value was there. But I think if you have the software, and you have the time, and you have the data, give it a shot, do it yourself. Changes away from the wellbore, finally. So, were there lateral changes? Remember those discontinuities? Perhaps it was a sand body or a sand unit with slightly different petrophysical properties that was perpendicular to the screen if you think about the distribution. I understand there are now 3D inversion products you can get from contractors. So as opposed to doing your top-down geosteering, you can actually do azimuthal geosteering and leverage 3D real-time inversion. Like I mentioned, that wasn't available at the time of this drilling campaign. And the case study I have seen was using the deep azimuthal data. So whether or not this shallower azimuthal resistivity data would be useful is up for grabs. That's it. Most people are still awake. I saw a couple of people nodding off, but thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ryan. We obviously do have a few minutes for questions, so hands up if you have any questions. Come on, don't be shy. There you go, on the back.
I knew that was coming.
Thanks, Ryan. Very nice. I'm interested in the NMR QV relationship. Did you think about going back and doing some experiments on your core to see whether you could build a better relationship than the one that's in the publication?
The answer, of course, is yes.
Oh, okay.
No,
Thanks.
no.
That's well done.
Pay me to do it, I'll do it, Chris. No. I had a look at the core, and unfortunately, you know, you go out to the core shed and it's just a big sand pit. So, you know, we did have some preserve plugs, but not from these target horizons. So any additional core analysis, I think, would have been fruitless. I think in this scenario, perhaps you might get away with some particle size distribution measurements. That would be handy here. QV, yeah, you might be able to pick up a handful of sand and get some wet chemistry data. But, excuse me, my preference, of course, is to get multiple salinity tests which require a competent core plug. It's early days. What I did see was that with the slide, but I won't show. Very good correlation between the logarithmic mean of the T2 and core QV. And I did make a first pass attempt at binning the NMR data to determine a grain size distribution. But yeah, didn't really get around to validating that with the core data. So I think the first step would be see what we could do with the existing data set. But the gut feeling is you would need more data, maybe LPSA to help out. But that was an appraisal objective. Okay. So exactly says our drilling engineering manager. No. In that part of the field, in fact, the fact that we intersected that deeper sand and confirmed that it was almost virgin oil saturation actually led to an additional infill well in that sand as part of this campaign. So it was a successful appraisal. I think the previous campaign, we did some wells that did that. I'm not sure they were as successful.
Apparently on your cross section, filling up the final target.
So the
seems to be a slide show the horizontal well. Filling
okay.
target.
So I'll answer that in two parts. The deeper interval was an appraisal objective.
Yeah.
Yep.
Your section. How is it going shallower in the stratigraphy?
Sorry, can I bring it up? This one?
Yeah.
Yep.
How do you reconcile that?
So, okay. So, like I mentioned, when I spoke to the geophysicist, the structural dip from seismic was very low. Yeah, we're talking less than 5 degrees. Yeah. But what this reflects, in my layman mind, is the internal dip, internal cross-bedding that you get in that gross sand package. So obviously this is pre-depositional, pre-faulting, if that makes sense, I'm not sure. 2 meters thick. Well, that's just a cartoon. Yeah, I mean that's just me. That's just me using paint to. Sorry. Well, okay. So here's. I guess I understand your question, and you know when you look at the core images, you really don't see. In you know those white light and UV images, you see very little bed dip. Yeah. This again is a oversimplified model. Perhaps it could be indicative of the dip or the. I mean, what you're trying to do is reflect the effect that this dip has in terms of your resistivity response. So indeed, if you've got grain size variation within those sand units as a result of depositional effects, then you're trying to honour that here.
Ryan, can I?
I'll accept that. Like I said, that was the first time I'd done this. So.
Yeah, it's Crew One here from PTP. I'd like to support that. I think a geologist as well is kind of upset geologist here. You know, to have that really steep internal bedding, you call it, or sedimentary cross bedding. You're talking about aeolian setting, but we in the fluvial deltaic environment here with the channel. So likely your channel is not going to be that thick, not that, you know, like what you draw here. And also the dipping, it's too high. So
they're valid points, and I'll take that on board. Like I said, I mean, you need to know your geology. It's a non-unique solution, right? So this is the petrophysicist with a lot of freedom, right, to try and get a match of the log data. Okay, so perhaps I should have gone back to our friendly geologists and said, or geophysicist, Wipu, where are you? Does this make any sense? So I accept that criticism. But it fit the model. So for me, there's an internally consistent result that fits the data. So I think that's a very useful conversation to have within the asset team to say, can we reconcile this or not? Yeah? Because for me, this is what's giving the best match to the resistivity response. At the end of the day, it didn't really matter too much, but yeah.
Okay, we'll get you more beer. So you can have more energy to answer a few more. I have one here.
Throw some more tomatoes, it's good.
Okay, you want a beer? Okay. Okay, on the back again.
Needs to learn how to play.
Hello. Okay. Based on the logs that you show is low resistivity pay, it's risks in the first page. I'm just curious. Can you share what kind of justification to drill the horizontal well?
The justification for the horizontal well.
Or thinking process to drill a horizontal
Sure.
well based on that risk.
So,
yeah.
Perhaps I didn't highlight it well enough, but the saturation determination for these reservoirs that went into the volumetric assessment was based on saturation height model derived SW based on the capillary pressure data. So from that, you get saturations like this. Yeah? The log derived SW wasn't used to underpin the volumetrics for this opportunity. Yeah? Indeed, if the saturations were this low and capillary pressure data and Dean Stark confirmed that, you wouldn't drill it. Right? The other thing to probably highlight was this was the first well that was drilled into this upper sand unit. The belief was that it was in pressure communication with the lower sand, the big bulky sand. So the asset team believed that they were in pressure communication. It should see the same pressure support, similar column heights. So the fact that log-derived saturations are so low, log-derived oil saturations are so low, don't let that confuse the issue. It was based on volumetrics, based on cap pressure, and that underpinned the volumetrics and the economic justification for that well. Any
All right.
others?
One last questions? Your last chance? Okay. Tamครับ. Oh.
Sorry, Chris, you've already had a question.
Drink more beer.
You know I've got a very loud voice, right? There's a comment about, you mentioned about measuring grain size along the, in the horizontal well and trying to relate that to your log response. But in a land far, far away, a place called Witch Farm, they used to drill some really, really long wells. And what they used to do was they would take the grain size and compute like the cumulative permeability based on the grain size along the well path, and then they would relate that to rock properties. So they would actually TD the well based on the cumulative KH along the well. But I thought that was kind of an interesting comment.
Mm. Yeah, I guess if you've got a good relationship between grain size and perm.
So you got rock type, grain size, and hence some kind of QV type of relationship as well.
I certainly think there's something there. I guess the other thing to remember in long horizontal wells is that in terms of your lag time...
Hole cleaning must be a bit dodgy.
In terms of your lag time, we're drilling with synthetic oil-based mud. You know, I mean, we were fortunate. We had a very good well site geologist and good well site team. So there was a fair bit of confidence in the composite data they gave us. But of course, there's going to be uncertainty there. I mean, okay, the mud gas, the total gas response here, you know, again, with lag time uncertainty, you know, this certainly doesn't fit with the top of the sand. Is there a depth issue here? In which case, you move this total gas up, you may well have said, well, there's little gas response in the lower part of that sand unit. It supports not completing the whole lot. So I think, I'd like to know more about that example you mentioned, but I think looking at softer data like grain size from the well site and mud gas, you do need to be careful, particularly in oil-based mud, like we were here with very unconsolidated sands.
Yeah, it was a hydraulic flow units type of grain size paper.
Okay.
I think from, I don't know, the early 90s in Marine and Petroleum Geology Journal, about the early 90s, 93, 94, something like that.
I'll dig it out.
Reference supplied with a cost of a small beer, I think.
Okay, with the essence of time, this is the last one. You can continue asking him later as well.
I'm first, okay? Sorry.
Oh, didn't see you, Kumwai, sorry.
Okay, I would like to ask you about what is your water saturation model that you for your field? What is the water saturation model that you use to find low contrast play in your field?
Okay, so the log-derived model is the Waxman-Smith's total water saturation.
Waxman-Smith, right?
Waxman-Smith's,
Okay.
yeah, which is one of your double-layer models, as opposed to the dual water. And capillary pressure-derived water saturation, like I mentioned before. That's what was used in volumetrics. So we clearly understood that logs are a problem. They're useful for understanding what's going on, but they weren't used in the volumetrics.
Yeah, okay. And so did you try to do with the another model, and how different? And so why finally you decide to use Waxman-Smith?
I'm a creature of habit.
Second?
I'm a creature of habit. No, I mean, I think you can, you know, we were fortunate that we had a decent cap pressure database here. So an independent water saturation methodology validated by Dean Stark was the gold standard. Any log-derived model is always going to be problematic, right? So throw out Archie, and then what do you have? If you're in a total porosity, total water saturation domain, Waxman-Smith's is my go-to water saturation. But of course, then you have issues with what QV model do you assume. So I think it doesn't really matter what log-derived water saturation model you would have used here.
Yeah.
You're probably still going to encounter similar issues. One caveat to that is if you go and read Paul Worthington's paper, there is what he refers to as the pseudo Archie model, right? So if we go back all the way to here, you have this pseudo Archie approach that Paul Worthington talks about. Grant talks about enhanced models, yeah? But all that's doing, it sounds fancy, but all it's doing is taking Archie and then changing your M's and N's so you match an independent water saturation, which in this case is Dean Stark or capillary pressure. So I think what you need to understand in this environment, just don't forget about log-derived water saturation, but use it very carefully.
Right. Okay. So, and one more question.
I thought that was the last question.
Sorry.
Come on.
So, how's different about your field for low contrast pay in Gulf of Thailand with another fields? I think maybe yeah. In Gulf of Thailand we have so many fields, right?
Very good question.
Yeah,
You
and
tell me.
how different and how should
You
you know and how should
Yeah, okay.
another company know another yeah.
So one thing that I was thinking on the flight over was it'd be nice to have a snapshot of the regional formation water salinity database in the Gulf of Thailand. I didn't get time to find that, and I admit that during this study I didn't do that either. So I don't know, honestly, if there is such a thing. If there is, fantastic. Can someone share that with me? Because I think if you're in this environment and say you're less than 5 to 10 kppm NaCl, then you need to have a think about low contrast pay. If the majority, I mean, I don't have a lot of experience in Gulf of Thailand, so if you have a number of other fields that have higher formation water salinities, then it's not so much of a problem. Perhaps some of the grey hairs in the audience could help out on that one. Paul, John.
Okay, I think let's just conclude and move on because otherwise we will hear all
Graham
night,
Paul.
right? It's a touchy subject and close to all of our hearts, Earth Science people. So on behalf of SPE Thailand, may I invite Dr. Jirawat Chiwarungrod on the stage to give the token of appreciation for the speakers tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay, and not just only one, we have another token from SPWLA as well, Andrew Cox, the president of the Bangkok
I've
chapter.
only got carry on. Can we get a photo for that one? All right, thanks, mate. Cheers.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Before we go to a closing remarks, just want to go back to this slides. So Kun Andrew asked me to update, not update, to correct the date. This is going to be 26th of November. So in the slides October. So it will be next month, 26th of November. Okay, and now a few closing remarks before we go to our lucky draw. Although a distinguished lecturer travel has been suspended, we will have a meeting here with a live broadcast, as Kun Kasian mentioned earlier. This again will address our two main objectives, networking and knowledge. The topics, as you can see on the screen, well placement, why non-drillers should care. In December, unlike our previous years, when we have our usual program break for Christmas, again, Kun Kasian mentioned earlier, Kun Marshall Hood from Bangkok Petroleum will give his talk on the topic named majors out, what lessons can be taken from the North Sea to allow Southeast Asia to prosper? A very interesting one, as we might not have heard so much of them. Next year, January, we will start on a topic where AI and robotics venture will tell us what's next, where our industry might lead into. Our upcoming meetings are scheduled as per our routine, the third Thursday of the month here at our home venue, the Landmark Hotel Bangkok. More details and update can be found on our website. SPE Asia Pacific is organizing series of virtual workshops all through the end of the year, and this includes the OTC Asia next month, I think the first week of next month. You can visit the SPE website for more details on the activity. And although a year away, the AIPN will have their annual summit here in Bangkok. In fact, the same venue that we hosted our SPE Thailand 40th anniversary, which is the Mandarin Oriental Hotel Bangkok. Not only the grand event, AIPN also have regular activities which can be found on their website at aipn.org. Last but not least, there are multiple ways to get in touch with us at SPE Thailand section. You can go to our official website at thaispe.org to find more information on the upcoming events, news announcements, young professionals, student scholarship, online webinars, and many more. Follow and like us on Facebook at Society of Petroleum Engineer Thailand section or at SPE Thailand. Friend us in LinkedIn and join the group at SPE Thailand section. What you can also do is to use your mobile phone to scan these QR codes shown here on your screen. It will direct you to right to what I just mentioned. Now and finally, our lucky draw. Can we please have Kun Ryan in front to help us to draw two winners? So the lucky draw, so besides our SPE Thailand water bottle, we have the tote bag, which is an activity from our young professional tote bag design contest. So this is the winner, and then we made the tote bag. Thank you, Ka. Thank you, Kun Ryan. Okay, and if what we serve you from 5 this evening until now is not enough and you still want a couple of more drinks, at the Huntsman Pub basement level of the hotel, please tell them that you come from our meeting, and if you are lucky, they will offer you the SPE 2-for-1 special. We have reached the end of the program, and this concludes the meeting for this evening. If you would like, if you have a feedback on where we can improve, any particular topic you would like to hear from us on how to organize, please do not hesitate to email us or let us know. We appreciate your suggestion. Thank you again to our speaker, our joint host, SPWLA Bangkok chapter, and most importantly, all our section sponsors right here in front of you. Please enjoy the rest of the evening and good night on behalf of the SPE Thailand section. ขอบคุณค่ะ
You got a photo, camera? Oh, you're a bunch of some software that can send it to both. We don't need it. You could do that too. I know. This is